The president has partially collapsed, but that he is in good condition. Good condition. It was stated earlier that his condition was stable. Now a hospital source, a doctor at the George Washington University Hospital, has told us that the president is in good condition, though one lung has partially collapsed. And Mrs. Reagan is there. She is said to be calm and collected. I'm going to give you the name of this man that has been reported to us as the assailant, simply because everybody else is reporting his name. He is John W. Hinckley, Jr. That is the report we have. John W. Hinckley, Jr., 22 years old. It is understood that he is from Evergreen, Colorado.
There have been plenty of entertainers and musicians who have committed serious crimes and still had a career after the fact. But today we're going to be talking about a man who committed such an intense and insane crime that you would think there is no possible way this man would be free today, let alone pursuing an actual music career and making more progress than he ever did before he committed said crime. But believe it or not, that is just a small footnote in this story, because this is a tale that will bring us down some very interesting and disturbing roads. The man in question is John Hinckley Jr., and the crime in question is shooting and attempting to kill the United States President, Ronald Reagan, while he was still in office. That only scratches the surface when it comes to his crimes, as he was eventually charged with 33 different criminal offenses, but was actually not sentenced to prison and was instead institutionalized. He is currently a free man and is allowed to release his artistic works online. In fact, he's even amassed a small following, and he intends to release an album, potentially sign with a record company, and essentially pursue a music career. Now, how could this possibly happen? How could a man shoot the current acting president of the United States, be charged with almost 36 different crimes, and still be around today as a free man with a potential music career on the horizon? Well, those are some questions we're going to be answering as we take a look at one of the craziest stories we have ever covered on Morbid Musicians. This is the story of John Hinckley Jr. John Hinckley Jr. was born on the 29th of May 1955 in Oklahoma, but by the time he was 4, his family had moved to Dallas, Texas, where his father, John Hinckley Sr., operated an oil company that he had independently created. This company already made his family quite wealthy, but over the next decade and a half, this wealth would become even larger, and it was clear that Hinckley Jr. came from a family with a substantial fortune. He attended Highland Park High School in Texas, and according to reports, he was a good student who actually had an interest in basketball and football. He was quite good at these sports, and by all accounts, he had a normal experience as a teenager in high school. This changed in the last couple of years when, reportedly, he stopped playing these sports and stopped socializing as much, instead opting to stay in his room and listen to music. This is also when he took an interest in creating music. He started learning the guitar and he began to write songs in his bedroom that would never see the light of day, but they did inspire him to pursue a career in his later life. He did graduate high school and he attended Texas Tech University in 1974. There he was an off and on student who didn't take his studies too seriously, and eventually he dropped out. Sometime between 1975 and 1976, Hinckley moved to Los Angeles to pursue a full-time career in songwriting. While he was there, he wrote to his parents about his travels and stated that they were not going well. He consistently asked for money, and at the time, his father had become the president and senior chairman of the Vanderbilt Energy Corporation. Many different publications wrote articles at the time that valued this company in the millions, with them consistently turning in profits and having one successful year after another. It's very likely that Hinckley Sr. was now a much wealthier man, and it's entirely possible that he was able to fund his son's time in Los Angeles for a while, but even then, Hinckley Jr.'s time in Los Angeles was short-lived, and by September of 1976, he had moved back home with his parents, who were now living in Evergreen, Colorado. This may have seemed like a normal endeavor at the time. A young man with a dream moves to a big city to try and pursue it, but subsequently fails and moves back home. But it was actually much more convoluted than that. For one, the actual letters he wrote had some concerning footnotes. He wrote about a girlfriend that he had started dating called Lynn Ann, who turned out to be a complete fabrication and never actually existed. The main red flag, however, was very strange, and it was one that would start a chain of insane events, and believe it or not, it came from the release of a movie that he watched while he was in Los Angeles. For most people, this movie is a classic piece of cinema. For Hinckley Jr., this movie changed his entire life and the lives of many other people. The movie Taxi Driver was released in 1976. It was directed by Martin Scorsese and it starred Robert De Niro. Although it only had a relatively low budget of $1.9 million, it grossed almost $30 million and ended up becoming a critical and commercial success. The movie tells the story of Travis Bickle, a 26-year-old veteran who is now a taxi driver in New York City. He suffers from PTSD, chronic insomnia, depression, and fights many other mental battles that all eventually culminate in him fighting a group of gangsters in order to save a 12-year-old prostitute named Iris. There are a lot of other plot lines that are in this movie, and I could talk about it for ages. But what's important to note is that the movie resonated with a lot of people when it came out. It was raw, it was gritty, it spoke about mental health, and it covered a lot of very real topics that other blockbuster movies avoided. John Hinckley Jr. was one of these starry-eyed viewers, and he fell in love with this movie instantly, reportedly watching the movie 15 times in the cinema. However, while most audience members were falling in love with the cinematography, the performances, and the story, John was developing a very inappropriate infatuation for the 12-year-old actress Jodie Foster, who played the child prostitute in the movie. As I mentioned beforehand, Hinckley had left college at this point and he was 21 years of age when this movie was released. But still, he obsessed over Jodie Foster for years. From 1977 to 1980, Hinckley's mental health drastically declined, and his obsession with Jodie Foster grew at a rapid pace. He was taking multiple different antidepressants every day, but these were not working. He said, "My nervous system is shot," in a letter that he wrote to his sister, referencing the antidepressants. In 1979, he purchased his first gun, and over the next couple of years, he added quite a few more to his collection. Finally, in 1980, when Jodie Foster started studying at Yale University, he actually moved to Connecticut to stalk her. He left her messages, he slipped her poems, and he even managed to get her on the phone a few times, but all of this was met with either confusion or anger. Hinckley realized that his advances were not working and decided that he had to do something much bigger to get her attention. He thought about multiple different crimes that he could commit in order to impress her, and ultimately landed on the idea that he should try and kill the current acting president at the time, Jimmy Carter. He actually trailed Carter from state to state with a gun, but eventually, after he made pretty much no progress with this plan, he got arrested for possessing a firearm in Tennessee. He went home with no money, a firearms charge, and he had essentially completely failed this mission. He was a broken man by his own doing, and at this point it seemed like Hinckley was really only dangerous to himself. I mean, he was clearly a disturbed man, but this strange tour of America was most likely an indicator that he was not going to do anything overly violent. At least that's what a psychiatric professional might have told you at the time, but boy were they wrong. This idea was still well and truly rooted in his brain, and by 1981, nothing had changed. He still wanted to do something that would capture Jodie Foster's attention, and at this stage, Ronald Reagan was now the president of America, and Hinckley had his eyes on him. The target was now in his crosshairs, and this time, Hinckley was going to pull the trigger. On the 28th of March 1981, Hinckley Jr. arrived in Washington, D.C. and checked into a hotel. He noticed in the local newspaper that Ronald Reagan was going to be delivering an address at the Washington Hilton Hotel just 2 days later, and he decided that this was the time to strike. He was actually on his way to New Haven, Connecticut, where he was going to once again stalk Jodie Foster, but this opportunity fell onto his lap, and it was clear that he believed this was the only true way to get her attention. We know this because he wrote one final letter to Foster that ultimately wouldn't be sent directly to her, but it was read aloud in the court trial, so we know exactly what it says, and it was one of the most disturbing letters Hinckley ever wrote to Jodie Foster. It said the following: Dear Jody, there is a definite possibility that I will be killed in my attempt to get Reagan. It is for this very reason that I am writing you this letter now. As you well know by now, I love you very much. Over the past 7 months, I've left you dozens of poems, letters, and love messages in the faint hope that you could develop an interest in me. I will admit to you that the reason I'm going ahead with this attempt now is because I just cannot wait any longer to impress you. I've got to do something now to make you understand, in no uncertain terms, that I am doing all of this for your sake. By sacrificing my freedom and possibly my life, I hope to change your mind about me. This letter is being written only an hour before I leave for the Hilton Hotel. Jody, I'm asking you to please look into your heart and at least give me the chance, with this historical deed, to gain your respect and love. It's clear from this letter that Hinckley had not only completely lost any sense of reality that he had, but also that he was actually stating that this act was only happening to impress Jodie Foster. In this letter, he also talks about being outside her dormitory, listening to her conversations, and many other creepy encounters that he had with the movie star. He was manic, and this letter had about every red flag you could possibly imagine. Unfortunately, nobody except for Hinckley would read this letter until after the event in question, because immediately after writing it, he went to the Hilton Hotel. The hotel in question was actually considered to be extremely safe, especially for political figures. After Reagan finished his address, he walked down a passage known as the President's Walk, which was created after Kennedy was assassinated. Although he normally wore a bulletproof vest, he was only going to be outside for a short period of time, and on this day it was deemed unnecessary for him to wear one. Hinckley managed to sneak into a crowd of admirers without being searched or even suspected. At 2:27 p.m., Reagan left the hotel and began walking towards his limousine with the Secret Service and local police standing near him and trailing close behind. He walked directly past Hinckley, who crouched on the ground, pulled out a blue steel revolver, and shot at Ronald Reagan and his team 6 times in less than 2 seconds. None of these shots directly hit the president, but almost every single shot had a significant impact. The first shot hit the White House press secretary James Brady in his head, shattering his brain cavity and knocking him to the ground. The second shot hit police officer Thomas Delahanty in the back of his neck, and he also fell to the ground. At this stage, Special Agent Jerry Parr had a split-second reaction to this shooting and grabbed Reagan. They started to run towards the limo. This is when the third shot came and just overshot the president, instead hitting a building behind them. It would have almost definitely made contact if it wasn't for Parr's quick reaction. Behind the two of them, another special agent, Tim McCarthy, was following them to ensure their safety, and upon hearing the third shot, he turned around, spread out his arms and legs, and made sure that he was as wide as possible in order to block any potential shots. This shot did come, and it actually hit McCarthy. The fifth shot hit the bulletproof window of the door that the president had just entered, and the sixth and final shot ricocheted off the limousine and actually did hit Ronald Reagan. The bullet grazed his rib and lodged inside his lung, which subsequently collapsed. The bullet ended up being 25 millimeters away from his heart, making it extremely close to being a fatal shot. At this stage, Hinckley had been wrestled to the ground, his guns were dispossessed, and many people, including citizens, started to attack him. In fact, Agent McCarthy, the man who Hinckley had just shot, had to pull certain people away from the scene so that he could prosecute him safely. Hinckley was restrained and taken to jail in DC, while Ronald Reagan was taken to the nearest hospital. Although the bullet had ricocheted and not actually hit Reagan directly, it caused a great deal of damage, and by the looks of things, it appeared that he was dying. In the limo, he was coughing up blood, and when he got to the hospital, he could barely breathe anymore. He was 70 years of age at the time and losing a lot of blood. His odds for survival were very low, but because he was in great physical shape and the medical team involved did everything that they needed to do at a rapid pace, they were able to fix his blood pressure, remove the bullet from his body, and stabilize him within a few hours. In this time, he lost half of the blood volume in his body, but he managed to survive, and by April 11th, just 12 days after he was shot, Reagan returned to the Oval Office. The police officer who had jumped in front of the bullet to protect Reagan, Tim McCarthy, was discharged before anybody else and was known nationwide as the hero who saved the president. He was given an Award of Valor the next year and became a member of the Secret Service in the late 80s. Thomas Delahanty, the other police officer at the scene, suffered permanent nerve damage to his arm, and although he was considered a hero, he was forced to retire from being a police officer. Finally, James Brady, the White House press secretary, was the last man to leave the hospital. This is because he was hit directly in the head, and his injury was by far the most severe. In fact, many different news outlets reported that Brady had been killed, but this was not true. He was stabilized and survived, but he was also partially paralyzed and was forced to use a wheelchair for the rest of his life. His speech was slurred, his memory was affected, and his neural functions greatly declined. All of this was the damage that one man inflicted in the space of 2 seconds. It was the most discussed thing in America for weeks, and the question now was, what was going to happen to John Hinckley Jr.? Many people thought that he would get the death penalty, some people thought that he was going to get life in prison, but as you know, neither of those things happened. Instead, we were given one of the strangest court trials of the 80s that ultimately led to a baffling conclusion. John Hinckley Jr.'s trial began in 1982 in Washington, D.C. As I mentioned previously, Hinckley came from a very wealthy family and they were able to provide him with the best legal defense that money could buy. This came in the form of Vincent J. Fuller, an accomplished lawyer who actually defended the notorious gangster Jimmy Hoffa. He also defended the likes of Mike Tyson, Don King, and many other high-profile clients, and let's just say he had a knack for getting his clients some pretty decent deals given the circumstances that they were in. But this case was obviously different. Hinckley Jr. had literally shot the President of the United States and 3 other people, paralyzing the White House press secretary in the process. The only way Vincent J. Fuller could possibly help his client avoid prison time was by using the insanity defense. However, this defense had only been used in around 2% of felony cases, and 75% of those cases were completely unsuccessful. Obviously, given the circumstances, this wasn't likely to succeed, but the trial commenced regardless, and a grueling 4-month process began where the prosecution and the defense both tried to define Hinckley's mental health, with the prosecution trying to define it as a personality disorder and the defense trying to define it as a serious crippling mental illness. In order to do this, they had to look into every aspect of Hinckley's life, including journal entries, phone calls, and letters that he had written. Hinckley actually stated that he would not cooperate unless Jodie Foster herself testified at the trial. Surprisingly, her lawyers agreed that she would in fact testify, probably hoping that this would help set the story straight and lead to John Hinckley being convicted. So she took the stand but made no eye contact with Hinckley, she kept her answers short, and she stated that he called and wrote numerous times but that it meant nothing. And finally, when she was asked what her relationship was with Hinckley, she stated, "I don't have a relationship with John Hinckley." Hinckley clearly wasn't very happy with this, as he threw a ballpoint pen at her and shouted, "I'll get you, Foster," before she left the room. In hindsight, all of this probably helped John's case, as he was seemingly quite manic for most of the trial. When you combine that with the ramblings and the testimonies, you can start to understand why a jury of his peers found John Hinckley Jr. not guilty by reason of insanity on the 21st of June 1982. Not guilty. Regardless of the reasoning, I don't think anybody thought that the jury would be saying those words on the day of John Hinckley's sentencing. But they did, and Hinckley was sent to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. There he had to undergo treatment for his disorders and mental conditions, and within weeks, they considered him to be unpredictably dangerous. Regardless of this, his time there was fairly tame, and he actually renewed his interest in music while he was being treated at the hospital. He also got therapy, played pool, wrote hundreds of letters, and seemingly did whatever he could to pass the time while he was being treated. The main thing he did was focus on his freedom. After only a few years in the institution, Hinckley applied for a court order that would allow him to visit home periodically. This was actually declined because when they searched his room, they found letters that were written to and from serial killer Ted Bundy. It was clear that Hinckley was still not in an okay place, but over the years, his antics calmed down and it appeared that therapy and medication was leading him down a successful path of rehabilitation, which subsequently led to him obtaining a few of his freedoms back. By 1999, he was allowed supervised visits to his parents' house. In 2005, these visits were extended and were unsupervised, and in 2009, he was allowed to be at his mother's home for 120 days of the year, and it seemed as if his full freedom was only down the road. However, in 2014, James Brady died, and the death was quickly ruled a homicide. This meant that Hinckley was officially a murderer, but there was no charge for this because of the year and a 100-day rule, which states that if the victim dies over 366 days after the incident, the perpetrator cannot be charged with the murder, even if it was the direct reason for the death. You would think that this death and the subsequent ruling would affect Hinckley's potential freedom, but honestly, it did very little, if anything at all, because around 2 years later, in September of 2016, John Hinckley Jr. was released and allowed to live full-time at his mother's home in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. This came with a laundry list of restrictions, most of which were specific to his case, such as possessing photos of Jodie Foster, contacting anybody from the victim's family or the victims themselves, visiting any graves of past presidents, and a whole host of other general restrictions like consuming alcohol, watching violent TV, and possessing firearms. But if we've learned anything about this case so far, it's that Hinckley is willing to fight for as much freedom as humanly possible, and that is exactly what he did, leading to a very strange chain of events that introduced us to his music. In October 2020, a federal court ruled that Hinckley may showcase and market his artwork, writings, and music publicly under his own name. His way of doing this was very interesting. He created a YouTube channel, and in December of 2020, Hinckley started to share his work with us. His original song, Majesty of Love, was the first video that he created, and it's also his most popular, garnering around 200,000 views in the last 9 months. On top of this, he does covers, and he's also stated that he actually intends to make an album in the not-so-distant future. His channel is currently doing quite well. Actually, when I started this script, he had around 17,000 subscribers, and now he has around 20. That might not seem like the most significant jump ever, but he shot Ronald Reagan, so the fact that he even has an active YouTube channel at all is pretty baffling. A few things have happened since he started his channel with regards to his case that could actually have an effect on his potential music career. For one, his mother passed away at the age of 95, which may actually affect the conditions of his release, as he was forced to live in his mother's residence when he was first let go. Now he is contesting those conditions. A hearing was set up for the 30th of August where his unconditional release would be considered. This hearing more than likely happened around a month ago, and I can't find any information on it whatsoever, but do not be surprised if John Hinckley is released on an unconditional basis, and be even less surprised if this has a dramatic effect on the popularity of his music. Although Hinckley's music isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, it would be silly to insinuate that he would have the same amount of popularity if it wasn't for his insane life story. However, he cannot talk about that story in any kind of public forum, whether that be to the press, on a blog, in his music, or to any journalist that might be interested in speaking to him. But if these conditions are lifted and Hinckley can't speak about his case freely in a public manner, then the promotion that this could potentially give to his music and to himself is astronomical. I only say this because it shows the potential that Hinckley actually has to make a successful album and a successful music career. I have no idea if this is something he even wants to do, but the window of opportunity is fast approaching, and it would only make this story even crazier. Although this story was globally reported when it happened, and it's an incredibly well-documented case, I feel like it's kind of been swept under the rug in recent years. Maybe because nobody was immediately killed, or there was simply too much for people to digest, but whatever the reason may be, I think overlooking this case is a mistake because this event had a ripple effect like no other. Firstly, the Brady Act was implemented in 1994, and this was a bill that mandated federal background checks on people in the US who purchase firearms. And it was backed by Reagan himself, who at this stage was consistently campaigning for more gun control. On top of this, the Insanity Defense Reform Act was put in place in 1984, and this was actually signed by Reagan himself. It was a bill that made obtaining a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity a lot more difficult to get. This, of course, was a direct response to the public outcry over John Hinckley's sentencing. Also, the whole incident in general made Reagan a lot more popular. Although he won the 1980 election pretty comfortably, winning by about 8 million votes, His next run was the second most lopsided election in American history. He won by almost 20 million votes, and he also won every single state in the Electoral College except for one. Now, the fact that he got shot is not the only reason he won so comfortably, and he was almost definitely going to win regardless, but the shooting did boost his approval rating considerably and make certain people change their minds on Reagan. All of this came from that day. Those 6 shots were fired in less than 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, everything changed. It is truly a bizarre story. From the reasoning, to the act, to the consequences, to the fact that the perpetrator is a free man making music on YouTube right now, today. The world is truly a crazy place.
Today, a federal judge approved the unconditional release of John Hinckley Jr. Remember, he's the man who shot and wounded President Ronald Reagan and 3 others in 1981. Hinckley was found not guilty by reason of insanity and then confined to a mental facility for decades. The judge said Hinckley could be freed from all restrictions. That's as soon as next June.